Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Banking on Experience. I'm your host, James Gilbert. Really excited about today's topic because I think it's so relevant in today's world, especially with the work from home environment. But we're going to talk about how FIs can lead digital disruption. And we're not just going to talk about what you can do externally to your members and to your customers, but we're also going to be talking about what you can do internally, which I think is something that's not talked about very often. So stay tuned, all the listeners. We're going to be right back with you. All right, everybody, thanks for joining another episode of Banking on Experience. Today, we are joined by our guest, Jim Perry. Jim, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, James. I appreciate it.
Jim, why don't you give us a little bit of an intro on who you are, what you're about?
That's a great big introduction there. I'm senior strategist at Market Insights. Now, some of you may know me from my daily Twitter feed. I'm out there focusing on industry trends and news about mergers and fintech and marketing and digital transformation, all that kind of thing. But our consulting firm, just to give you a little idea, we've been helping community banks and credit unions for, well over 25 years. The majority of our work's really focused on helping our clients understand their data, data about their customers, about their markets, about their culture, the data that they need to understand in order to make strategic adjustments to everything from their delivery strategy to their marketing, to their staffing, even to their business model.
My background is in data. I've talked a lot about this, and I can't stress how important it is, especially right now, to be able to leverage that. So we're going to talk a little bit about that throughout this episode. But I wanted to ask you, why is this topic so important right now?
Wow, that's a great question. We've actually been talking about this for so long, you'd think, how could it possibly need to be talked about again? But, before the coronavirus pandemic, there were so many community-based institutions that were just kind of slow to respond to the digital age, really. Some felt like they had plenty of time to get things together. They didn't really feel any incentive to tackle digital transformation. And there were actually, quite frankly, a lot of smaller communities where consumers weren't really pressing their FIs to do anything. The other thing that often happens in this industry is buzzwords start floating around and people kind of zone out and they end up deferring to old habits. But then, of course, COVID hit. It shut down our branches, and some of these lagging institutions really had to scramble just to be able to provide some kind of baseline. They needed to respond to what customers were asking for. I mean, let's face it, change really doesn't happen very quickly in our industry sometimes, but the pandemic really hit the accelerator. I think that banks and credit unions just need to talk about this now in order to catch up. They've been making some really fast changes because I don't care if you're big or small or rural or urban, everybody's really getting disrupted out there. So I hear a lot of consultants right now trying to anticipate how this is all going to impact consumers long term. But I think the reason we're talking about it right now is because regardless of what happens in the future, COVID has already liberated a lot of consumers from that transactional dependency on the branch. So that means we have to be talking about this topic.
I love it. You talked about some buzzwords, and I mean, we all know this. Digital transformation is a buzz phrase. Digital disruption is a buzz phrase. So let's actually dive into this. Let's define it for the listeners and the audience. Like, what is it? What does digital transformation really mean?
Well, let's first start with that digital disruption, because again, it's used a lot. There's probably a lot of folks that say, okay, what does it really mean? It's basically that kind of change that's always occurring when any kind of new technology or new business model ends up affecting the value proposition of something that's already existing. We can think of plenty of examples like Uber, Amazon, Netflix, how they totally disrupted industries. And in banking, all we have to really do is look around. Umpqua, Capital One, they disrupted our concept of the branch. Robinhood, they disrupted investing. Prosper disrupted lending. And Chime, you just keep looking at what they're doing. They're out there disrupting mobile banking as we know it. And then, as you say, there's that other big buzzword, digital transformation. And I think the reason there's even less understanding about what that means is because there's no one size fits all strategy that's going to help people figure this thing out. So we just have to understand that digital transformation requires exactly that transformation. It's not just about technology. It's about culture. It's about business model. It's about process. As Jim Marous is always talking about, it's even about your mindset. It really requires dramatic change.
It's interesting that you mentioned a lot of those brands because, you know, I've had a lot of experience with working with credit unions and community banks throughout my career. But I mean, there was a good stint there that I was not in the financial services industry at all, right? Like that wasn't a play for us. But I still knew all of those brands that you had mentioned. There's a reason for that, right? I mean, when
right.
Every single one of them created a convenience factor for the consumer. And that convenience factor made the customer experience and the member experience that much easier, right? So I think that ultimately the core of like digital transformation and digital disruption, I think the core of a lot of that resides in the experiences that we create and making it more simple and easier way with less clicks, with less involvement in people if that's what somebody wanted, but if more involvement with people if that's what somebody wanted, allowing the options. I think that's the core of a lot of this, is making sure that the experience is simplified for the consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, just think of the changes that have happened in our industry, but in our world in general since the iPhone came into being. You know, what is it, 13 years ago now?
13, yeah.
Can you even imagine what our lives was like before that? But while you were talking, I was remembering a quote that I've often used in some speeches. It's by a guy named George Westerman at MIT. He said that when digital transformation is done right, it's like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. But when it's done wrong, all you have is a really fast caterpillar. I see so many people that are trying to integrate these digital technologies just into maybe the customer-facing part of their bank and not tending to the back end, not tending to their employees, not tending to their processes, and it fundamentally shuts everything down.
It's like the phrase of, you know, technology is nothing without the people behind it. I mean, we're running into this all day long, and from a marketing perspective, like if you've seen like Chief Martech and the graphic that shows like the incremental change of technology that's happened over the course of like 10 years. And, you know, when I very first started, it was just this like tiny little graph with some vendors on there. And now it's just like, you can't even see what vendors are on there because they're all so small and it's just huge. Right. So I think that I love what you just said, because I think that it's exactly where the focus falls flat. And that's that oftentimes we bring on technology, but we don't empower the people to use it. Or we bring on technology and we haven't thought through how it's going to impact other functions. So it'll be a functional sell or something like that, where maybe marketing goes out and buys a piece of technology, but they haven't thought through, well, how is this going to impact support and service, right?
Exactly.
So I think that there needs to be more collaboration around the technology that we bring on, but also process, because if you're going to bring on tech, you've got to make sure that there's process in place that's going to trickle down to, if it touches certain employees, that they're also trained on it. And that becomes an afterthought, and it's unfortunate.
I totally agree. There are so many times, I mean, we've worked with clients where we'll go in and they're really excited, like their director of marketing is really excited about some of the changes they made to their mobile app, but nobody on the front line knows how to talk about it because they don't use it. And nobody in their call center even understands it because they forgot to connect the dots and make sure everybody in the institution really understood what the new functionalities were coming on board. And so often that's simply because they're adding these little tech add-ons instead of becoming a tech-driven organization.
I mean, man, I don't talk about our product ever on the podcast, but this is a moment that I actually wish we could. But I'm not going to stay true to our promise to all of the listeners. But let's talk a little bit about the how. So we've talked about what institutions can do, what they might be doing wrong, and what they could possibly be doing that they aren't doing today. But let's talk about what's a little bit of a framework that we could give people, Jim, that they could take away from this and say, I could start here. Where do they start?
Okay. Well, actually, I can think of two things off the top of my head. First, and this is a big one, don't confuse digitization with digital transformation. A lot of financial institutions, if you think about it, you've all really been doing digitization for at least 25 or 30 years. Every time a new technology comes on board, you make these incremental little digital improvements to either your products or your services. And the thing is, most of those new technologies and improvements you're implementing in siloed systems, and they don't easily talk to each other. You've got CRM for customer engagement, but you've got fraud alerts managed over here, and you've got credit decisions over here. And of course, marketing is functioning on its own dashboard way over here, and they don't talk to one another. To really achieve transformation, it involves reinvention. And the second thing is, I think you really have to begin by honestly assessing your unique situation, because you have to prepare your environment for these kind of changes. That means looking at your branch network, looking at your call center, your back office, your C-suite, your employees. You have to establish why you're trying to do these things, but then you got to make sure everybody knows it and understands why.
I don't think the back office is talked about enough.
Right.
It's like that. Oh, man. And I hope we have some back office employees and some back office managers and stuff that are listening to this, because it should not be an afterthought. They're as pivotal to the experience as anyone, right?
Oh, my gosh. Yes. We all know that they can absolutely, not by any ill intent, but just by working in the same way they've worked for the last 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. If they don't change the way they're functioning as well, it shuts everything else down. It can totally change the customer experience.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we've been kind of framing this up a little bit, but I wanted to ask you if you feel like there's specific people that people can get involved. So, when I worked for CloudCherry, there was a very specific framework when people were doing a transformation with their customer experience, where you had to have very specific functions involved in that in order for the strategy to be successful. So what functions of a business, especially at an FI, need to be involved upfront in the strategy and in the planning of doing something like this?
I really think that depends a lot upon the size of the institution, because there's so many community-based FIs, as an example, where you've got people wearing multiple hats, where you've got somebody who's primarily in charge of marketing, but they're also partially involved in data management. I think the overarching rule should be that the team has to be interdisciplinary. It has to represent your basic functions of your entire organization, because if there's not kind of representative input and understanding that can easily branch out into all areas of your enterprise, you're going to miss a step.
That's really well put. If I did have to frame it up, I personally think that it can't be driven from the organization that typically touches digital the most, which is marketing.
Oh, right.
And by the way, I'm a marketer. So I
self-disclosure, right?
it cannot be driven just from a marketing organization. It's got to have the rest of the functions involved. And, I even talk about this in the B2B world because, I've had a lot of experience in the B2B world. And one of the things that I speak a lot about is how important it is to have other functions of the business involved, simply because there's an amount of data that you also capture in this journey and in this process that really should serve other functions of the business. And I do not know very many companies that do that well, right? They can't take the data that they're capturing in a journey. They can't take that data that they're capturing from a marketing perspective and serve it to, let's say, customer support and service to make sure that it's a better experience for them when they actually reach out to a contact center. And that's one of those things where, I mean, to me, that is the future of even marketing, right? Is even though marketing shouldn't drive this alone, it should be a really a business strategy where everyone's driving it. But ultimately, I think that's some of the future of marketing as well, as being able to figure out like what is the real journey that our buyer's going through. And number two, not only the journey, but how do we feed this to our business so that we empower the business as a whole?
Right. And part of what you're really getting at, I think, is that regardless of the title, almost, regardless of the function in the organization, you have to have people that are driving this initiative to really be the customer champions. You know, we talk a lot about customer centricity in the industry these days, but there are really not a lot of folks that are doing it really, really well. You know, we're still looking at retail examples to drive what customer centricity is really all about. Now, honestly, there are plenty of FIs that are out there doing amazing work, but as an industry overall, we still have a long way to go. So, but within an organization, if you can find those true champions of your customer and the customer journey, get them together in a room, give them the assignment of helping you figure out your transformation strategy. And that's at least going to be a strong rudder to make sure that you don't lose sight of what should be driving the end result.
Yeah, I'm with you there 100%. And for the listeners out there that are listening today, I actually got to know Jim a little bit through an article that he wrote in Financial Brand that is aligned to this topic right here. So it's very, very, very relevant. But I want to ask you a few things about that article. I mean, you did such a really good job at laying out a framework. There's at least three things that you could focus on to try and do some of this. And I think that one of the things that you had mentioned was how brand and culture can play a role. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do you feel like brand and culture play a role in this digital transformation and digital disruption?
Well, one of the points that I make in that particular article, I talk about Tony Hsieh from Zappos, who's always out there saying that brand and culture are just two sides of the same coin, which is absolutely true. But I mean, okay, think, for example, about how many financial institutions organize their brand or their culture around the importance of face-to-face customer service, right? Think about that. And now think about how COVID-19 has totally turned that on its head. You know, if they can't provide high quality customer service in digital space, perceptions of the brand are going to be changed. You know, if the customers don't see you as a tech-enabled, digitally functioning organization, when you try to actually bring this all on board, that means you've got to keep adjusting your brand and your culture in order to support that you're trying to accomplish. I ask financial institutions a lot, how is digital transformation actually going to add to or detract from your primary brand position? And oftentimes that requires them to even think about, well, what is our brand proposition? What is our promise? What are we, how does our culture support that? But when you start answering that question, you can begin to imagine or see where there's misalignment between that and a truly digital functioning organization. I really think that digital transformation isn't just about accelerating new technology. You also have to have the right people in the right jobs in order to make this happen. You've got to have the right internal processes in place. And that requires every individual within a financial institution to assess their own digital literacy. I mean, CIOs obsess about this stuff all day long, but does your mortgage loan officer think about what are the new digital products that are coming online at our competition all over the country? Do they make themselves aware of how digital technology is being brought to make customers' lives simpler, I think that has to happen.
Yeah, I like the fact you mentioned something with the brand promise, because I think that there's a book that I absolutely love that I would highly recommend for any listeners out there. And I don't know if you've read this too, Jim, but it's called Story Brand by Donald Miller. Have you read it?
No, I haven't.
It is just a beautiful framework of starting with the brand promise and making it clean enough to where you can actually articulate the value of that to every customer you bring on. And the framework of what he puts out in that book is just so well done, and it can be translated across any industry, any company. I do believe that you have to have that brand promise so clear that, number one, anyone who reads that's external out of your company and out of your FI can understand it and know that they're getting the value out of it. But number two, to your point, that every part of the journey is empowering your employees to be able to deliver on it. And, I think that's the beauty of having brand and culture play such a huge role in this, is because it really can be the driving factor behind the purpose of why you're trying to do it.
The thing about the disruption that we've seen in the industry over the last 5 years, the last 10 years, sometimes financial institutions just don't stop and realize how much that's really reshaped the consumer's view of financial institution. We talk forever about, banking is not just a place. It's something you can do in so many different formats. I don't know if you happen to use the Credit Karma app as an example.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Oh, my gosh. I think that's just a brilliant kind of way that one more aspect of a relationship that I should have been able to have with my bank or credit union has totally been provided by someone else. And it's like, okay, so you're providing me all this information to help me make personal choices that are going to benefit my financial life. How is it that my financial institution, my primary financial institution, didn't think of that first? And how is it that they're not doing anything about it now?
Well, Jim, you bring up a really good point, and I don't know the answer to this, but I have an inkling a little bit. And I think one of the biggest challenges that FIs face right now is the fact that the core system that they've had for such a long time just really doesn't play well with new technology, nor does it play well with some of the just normal processes. I mean, there's credit unions out there that we've talked to that, use a specific core, and in that core, like, they have a completely different system for mobile. They have a completely different system for their mortgages. They have a completely different system for credit cards. So it's like really bringing that experience together and tying it together is really where I think the future of financial services is. And to your point, like, if you don't do it as a financial institution, a fintech company will come and do it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And
they'll steal the thunder from you. And they'll likely steal your customers too. So, I mean, it's one of those things where now you're having fintech companies, like a lot of the brands you had mentioned, that are now trying to tackle some of these other issues that are typically done at a credit union or a community bank. And they're literally just stealing the share of wallet from them because they've got to focus on digital.
Absolutely. And they keep chipping away at the traditional relationship that a financial institution has had with its customer. And I think, to your point earlier, one of the problems I see all the time is when financial institutions actually start their conversation about digital transformation. So many times the first question they ask is, what does our core provider offer? Instead of, what does our customer need? And, the fintechs out there, they're starting with the latter question. They're starting with, what do customers need? What are the pain points? How can we help?
I really like that a lot.
It's all about reframing.
There's another thing that you mentioned in your article that I did want to touch on. You had mentioned relevant data.
Mm-hmm.
that can be broadly defined across different organizations. But what do you feel like relevant data is in the whole process of digital transformation, digital disruption, even the member and customer experience? There is relevant data. So what do you think that is?
Right. First, real broadly, I think it's that kind of key data about the customers you serve, the competition that you're engaging, the costs that you incur, and the market opportunities that exist. Because fundamentally, though, it's data about the consumer, about your customer, your member, and their specific journey with your financial institution. I really think, like I mentioned a minute ago, digital focus has to address customer pain points. And that also requires customer feedback. And it really means understanding customer behavior to the degree that that's possible. None of these things are static. And these pain points happen anywhere along not just one customer journey, but any number of customer journeys. People often say, again, customer journey as if it's just one thing. But, there's a customer journey when people are searching for information, when they're looking for advice, when they've just become a new customer and there's onboarding. That's a whole different journey. Then there's a journey for routine transactions. And in order to understand all of those journeys, you've got to understand your customer's profile and their preferences. It's important to look at their digital and mobile behaviors. I think you have to weigh their longevity, their profitability. And then when you have that hard data that helps you kind of segment and understand what your consumers look like, then you've got to augment that with focus groups. You've got to have conversations and test these assumptions that you're making with actual live conversations with your customers to say, tell me what you really think.
I'm with you. And I actually like how you broke out the journeys, because that's something that we did a lot when I was at Cloud Cherries. We actually call them micro journeys. And we'd focus on, all right, if somebody needs to open up a credit card, that's a unique journey. If somebody wants to do a mortgage, that's a unique journey. And the feedback that you get, and again, the data that you're collecting in that journey it should be unique to that journey, but it's also relevant to be able to push that data on to other functions of the business, like we were talking earlier, where backend can use it as leverage, where if they're already having a conversation with support and they know that they've already gone through like a credit card application and they don't know that they've been approved for it yet, that's a good opportunity for them to talk about it. But it's very rare that the systems allow that to happen. Well, Jim, we're almost at time, but I did want to ask you and help the audience understand, like, who are some FIs that that are doing this really, really well?
Gosh, obviously you could point to a lot of the big banks and regional banks for examples. I actually wish I had some more examples from community-based institutions. I think of Citizens Bank of Edmond. I mean, they really stand out down in Oklahoma. Great work they're doing. First Bank in Colorado, I just saw that. I think they moved their core to the cloud. It's symptomatic of a lot of changes they've been making on their digital transformation. But you might remember back in February, it was announced that Lending Club was buying or acquiring Radius Bank in Boston. When I think about Mike Butler at Radius, I mean, he's like a perfect example of, successful digital transformation, because he really reinvented their whole business model and their culture. They took it from a 2-branch community bank to a digital-only fintech-enabled bank. There's a lot of people that are still waiting to see what that acquisition is going to look like at the end, but the model of work that Mike did on the front end to make that all happen was really pretty incredible.
Jim, if there are FIs out there that wanted to reach out to you for help with doing this digital transformation and digital disruption, what's the best way for them to reach out to Jim?
You can certainly go to our website, formarketinsights.com. Look for me on Twitter. My handle is mi_Jim. That's probably the fastest and easiest way.
Awesome. Jim, thank you so much for being our guest today.